China.
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 How many of us know the name of a Chinese politician other than Xi Jinping? What is the history of the world's second largest economy? Is there a clear path for future Sino-British relations? Many of us lack a clear understanding of China and its global trajectory. This is a fundamental issue, given that one of the foreign policy questions of the next 50 years will be, how do you solve a problem like China? For the next few episodes, Spicy Takes will be unpacking some of the key areas driving these questions. We will consider Chinese history, its economic underpinnings, and their technological strategies. It has been a demystifying process for us, and we hope it will be for you too.
For this week's episode, we explore the Belt and Road Initiative. As Xi Jinping's flagship foreign infrastructural investment project, it encapsulates modern China's global ambitions. Financing $1 trillion worth of highways, railways, ports and pipelines across Africa and Eurasia, it inevitably stokes global economic growth and productivity. However, issues surrounding environmental sustainability and debt trap diplomacy remain. We learnt a great deal from the following discussion, and we hope you do too.
Welcome back to the best political analysis show on the planet. Spicy Takes returns. Now, as the British government talks big game about levelling up, we thought it would be appropriate to examine a set of policies that are actually as significant as FDR's New Deal. And China's Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road Initiative, would be a great place to look. It's a foreign policy strategy loosely discussed in the media and used as a way of characterizing China's aggressive expansion in recent years. But what actually is the initiative? How does it affect international development? And how has the coronavirus pandemic impacted this flagship approach? Well, to answer these questions and more, we are lucky to be joined by Dr Benjamin Barton. Ben is an assistant professor in politics, history and international relations at the University of Nottingham's Malaysia campus. He was a research assistant at the College of Europe and undertook a joint PhD programme with King's College London and Hong Kong University. He's currently researching China's expanding security footprint on the African continent. Ben, welcome to Spicy Takes.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And just reading over that intro there, you seem to be quite the international man of mystery. What motivated you to work in all these different places at such a young age?
I guess, well, to start off with, I would say that I was born in the UK, but by the age of 3, my parents relocated to France. So from a young age, I was exposed to new countries, a new language, a new culture. And I've always had that kind of at least bilingual or bicultural dimension. And then, not satisfied with staying in France, I wanted to go back and live life in the UK. And I guess one thing led to another, and my parents were quite pro-European, so there was also that dimension to it. But it was actually at the College of Europe where I started to take an interest in China, because we had, as part of the international relations program, we had a module on EU-China relations, and the Professor Jing Men, who taught that module, I found that fascinating. And there were, for example, there were classes on EU-China-Africa relations, EU-US-China relations. And I guess one thing led to the next. I ended up in a PhD program and wanted to live in Asia. So that's why I did the joint PhD program, because it allowed me to stay for about a year and a half in Hong Kong. And after that, I wanted to return to Asia I loved living in Hong Kong, so I was looking for opportunities, and one came up here in Malaysia. So that's a kind of very brief synopsis of the international dimension.
Well, and you touch on Europe, which is something that we will return to later. But before we kind of get into the meat of some of the the questions underpinning the European approach to China, I just wanted to begin on if you could just briefly sketch out for people listening what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is.
Sure. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a kind of China's international policy for infrastructure development. It's nothing new in the sense that actually Chinese companies which are involved as Chinese construction companies, Chinese policy banks. You can also add to that different layers of the Chinese government, for example, Chinese provinces, which help support some of their local companies which need to go outside of China to do business related to infrastructure construction or development or financing. Essentially, Chinese companies have been doing that, or at least kind of becoming experts in that since the turn of the 21st century onwards. The Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's kind of signature foreign policy design, which encapsulates this expertise that China now has under the framework of what is the revival of the old Silk Road, both the land Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, so the two components essentially of the Belt and Road Initiative. And from China's perspective, it's essentially looking to capture parts of a kind of future economy, or that is big infrastructure projects, either on land, for example, building railway lines, building motorways, highways, in some cases building condominiums, sometimes even projects like theme parks have been considered as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then the maritime dimension, which is really about building new ports, regenerating new ports. And in these instances, it's always trying to create business opportunities for Chinese construction companies, for Chinese policy banks, and then also for Chinese laborers who will be sent overseas to help as part of these infrastructure deals. So it's really, trying to create opportunities in a market which in China has become quite saturated, because China's own economic miracle was inspired by this kind of state-driven infrastructure model, and the east coast of China essentially is, there aren't that many opportunities anymore for these for these kind of construction companies or policy banks. So the aim is to create opportunities overseas to help these firms and those who are specialized in this in this market, to create opportunities for them so that they don't have to rely on what is a quite saturated market in China. Mm-hmm. That's really the Chinese angle towards this. Now, there's also one which is that the world, and particularly emerging economies, and if you take Southeast Asia as a case in point, really need infrastructure financing. And to help a lot of countries move from, say, kind of lower developing economy status towards middle income, and then from middle income economy status up to fully industrialized. And that's the case, for example, of a country like Malaysia, which badly requires infrastructure investment and development. And it's difficult these days for countries to find a kind of easy source of financing, and on top of that, the construction companies and expertise and labor which comes with it. So the Belt and Road Initiative essentially is that, in a nutshell. It's allowing countries to tap into a relatively easy source of financing, and particularly useful for countries who've been seeking to shop around in their own infrastructure projects, over the past 10, 15 years, which no one has really been interested in financing, but suddenly the BRI has come along, and that's created a new opportunity for them too. So I guess the takeaway would be that although the BRI is essentially a Chinese-driven initiative, the important thing to remember is that actually local actors in the recipient countries are actually the ones often who are proposing projects and driving the projects which are then accepted in China and implemented by Chinese actors with the help of local companies too. So that's, I think, a kind of short description of what the BRI entails.
Lovely. That was very interesting and a nice summary. I was also thinking, because I read the other day that the investment that was, or the financing that was provided to Djibouti for some of its major investment projects from China equated to around 75% of Djibouti's GDP.
Right.
And I just was wondering if you could sort of outline sort of
the extent of loans that are being taken out by certain countries, and which regions China is actually favouring? Is it Africa? Is it Eurasia? Where is most of their financing actually going? And also, I know you touched on it there with the motorways, the ports, but which types of financing do they actually favour in these different regions? So is it energy investment? Is it railway lines, ports, or military bases?
Yeah.
What do they favour?
So the Belt and Road Initiative, at least if you take the maritime component, so the land and maritime components were both launched in 2013, but the maritime component originally was targeting ASEAN countries because it was a way of kind of mitigating China's more assertive behavior in the South China Sea. So essentially the bulk of the geographic focus has been primarily on Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia. Now, as we've gone along, China's actually rolled out the BRI to, as mentioned, the African continent, Europe, which was meant to be the end point essentially for tapping into kind of, the EU's market, the single market. And now you see even Latin America, Central America projects, which essentially have nothing to do with the kind of old interpretations of the Silk Road, are falling under the aegis of the BRI. And actually, the only parts of the world which are not really involved are North America and Australia, although actually Australia is debating whether it should be become an official signatory of the BRI. Now, as mentioned by the question, this has raised issues relating to debt sustainability. Okay, so actually there's an ongoing debate, particularly in Africa, with regards to what do African states who are now also facing a recession caused by COVID, particularly with the drop in prices of natural resources, what are they going to do in terms of paying back the debt, and what's China's position as well? So this is quite a prominent debate. Actually, the data shows that there's only a handful of cases of countries who are really badly exposed to Chinese debt, and Djibouti is one of them. Nigeria is another. Montenegro is another in Europe, and it's actually more a case of if we talk about the African continent, China is, in terms of an individual country, the largest provider of grants and loans, but because usually most of these loans are done through multilateral agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, the Paris Club. So China's kind of a standout in that respect. And, you could argue that, well, in some cases it is unsustainable. And this is one of the risks inherent to BRI financing, is that it's not always clear whether the local decision makers are actually aware of the risks that they're taking. For example, the standard gauge railway project in Kenya, although undoubtedly needed in Kenya in terms of upgrading infrastructure, actually the small print would reveal that the cost of this railway line between Mombasa and Nairobi was actually apparently 3 times the cost of a kind of normal railway line, or that executed by, let's say a kind of normal tendering process. And not only that, the interest on it was something like 6%, that to be confirmed, which is actually a lot higher than the normal commercial rates offered by commercial banks. So, the question is often asked about, is the BRI a strategic initiative? It may be to a certain extent, but there's also a very strong commercial aspect to it, not just in terms of the construction companies getting contracts, but also in terms of Chinese policy banks being able to leverage interest out of those projects. Now, in terms of what kinds of projects have been prioritized, indeed, there's always a connection back to how this helps China's own economic growth, but also national security, if you like. So if you take Southeast Asia, you see, and South Asia as well, a lot of projects are indeed connected to either China being able to diversify its routes for the import of natural resources. So, for example, building pipelines into Myanmar, which run up to the Yunnan province in the southern part of China, in order to avoid oil tankers having to go through the Malacca Straits, which is often considered to be a kind of choke point. There's also investments in ports, for example, in Sri Lanka, which are seen as a way of kind of facilitating the transport of commercial goods and a transit point for Chinese for goods going to and from China. So that's often seen as a kind of a driver behind BRI projects. But actually, I don't think there's been a very clear methodology in terms of what kind of projects have been selected. Because I think that the aim has been to amass as many projects as possible, at least up until the COVID-19 pandemic, in order to make the BRI from a qualitative perspective stand out, qualitative and quantitative perspective stand out. So it's and that's worked because it's really, it's become a kind of multi-billion-dollar initiative, and it's encompassing a vast array of projects. But I don't think that the methodology has really been thought out, and that's probably due to the fact that the governance in China of the BRI is quite disaggregated, meaning that although the central government is the one which kind of draws the image and the definition of the BRI and provides the kind of impetus of the majority of the funding, actually what we see in practice is that Chinese provinces and their own state-owned companies which are located in those provinces are the ones which tend to drive what projects are pushed for, hand in hand with the local actors I was talking about earlier who have their own agendas. I guess just to give an example of that would be in Sri Lanka, under the leadership of Mahinda Rajapaksa. He, for example, pushed the Hambantota airport and port projects, which are seen to be white elephants, because this was part of his re-election strategy leading up to the elections in 2015 in Sri Lanka. So we see that in fact wasn't China imposing projects upon Sri Lanka, it was in fact the Sri Lankans driving the process there too.
I suppose it's clear that for China it has sort of commercial and security interests for financing these infrastructure projects abroad. But what do you think is the sort of central rationale for it? I understand there's a lot of different stakeholders, so it's quite difficult to give just one reason. But what do you think was the reason for Xi's 2017 announcement that there was of the BRI? What motivated it?
Well, I think so. There's the economic aspect I mentioned earlier, that it's a way of outsourcing, production in China, overproduction in China. I think that has to be the kind of main push towards the BRI. But of course, I think Xi's it was a kind of good marketing ploy essentially of there are all these Chinese actors who are out already in Africa and in South Asia doing all these infrastructure projects. He kind of remodeled that under his own policy drive, and that essentially becomes his legacy now that that's been written into the kind of Chinese Communist Party's own constitution. That brings into play the kind of strategic dimension which has been discussed. What are the long-term strategic implications of the Belt and Road Initiative? And there clearly are some, which would be, to help China's push towards becoming a world power, essentially, or redesigning the international system as we know it. And I guess the issue now is that going to actually work for China or not? Because there's a lot riding on the BRI, and what we've seen up until now is that although there have been a handful of successful projects, I guess one would be the COSCO takeover of the Port of Piraeus, which has made the Port of Piraeus, at least in Europe, one of the most profitable and active ports there. There have been a lot of duds as well. Another example would be this promised highway in Montenegro, which is a highway to nowhere essentially, and is one of these projects which the Montenegrin government has been pushing for a long time. No one wanted to finance it. Similar to actually the airport in Hambantota, it was promised to, it was presented to Americans, to Danish financing, and they all turned it down because they said this is not financially viable. So if the BRI is to accumulate a string of mismanaged projects and financially unviable projects, that's going to hurt the strategic dimension to it, which is that essentially, coming back to the point you raised earlier about debt sustainability, can China leverage diplomatic and political or even strategic gain out of the funding that it's providing via the BRI?
Africa has been mentioned previously, and this is a key area of study of yours. One of the most illuminating statistics I came across when researching for this interview was that in recent years, China's lending has actually grown to exceed the combined loans of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Paris Club. Now, this is according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And nowhere else is this more the case often than in Africa. And we've discussed the debt trap diplomacy before. And the Centre for Global Development have actually outlined 8 nations at risk of debt distress. And as Pranav alluded to before, Djibouti is actually one of these countries. So the question that I was wondering is, how does this new form of development financing actually compare with the traditional Western model? Because we're kind of kidding ourselves if we say that, oh, the IMF and World Bank form of funding a lot of these projects via what are known as structural adjustment programs. So debt relief that is often conditional on very high levels of austerity, lots of deregulation and currency reforms, where nations don't necessarily have the institutional framework to deal with a kind of market-based system. And they're often brutally painful. So how do they stack up against one another?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because I mean, and this is something which has been debated, for some time now, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's this comparison between the Washington Consensus and, what Joshua Cooper Ramo called the Beijing Consensus, in terms of their approach to providing loans and aid, although aid defined according to China isn't exactly the same as defined by OECD standards. I mean, essentially, I think that the African continent received a massive boost when China started to provide this kind of financing. Why? Because at that moment in time, the only recourse for funding, particularly of large-scale infrastructure projects, was from, indeed, multilateral banks such as the World Bank, the IMF. And actually, if you look at the World Bank in particular, it's really stopped providing financing for these kind of large-scale infrastructure projects. Why? Because they're considered to be risky in terms of financing projects. They don't really meet this kind of idea of the market should be driving growth, not public funds as such. They're considered to be kind of low yield and long-term projects, so not short returns, which is encouraged by the kind of market-based approach under the Washington Consensus. And often they were tied, at least in the perception of the African continent, to the kind of persona of leaders, the leaders who wanted this aura of being able to promise their people building football stadiums and white elephants, as mentioned earlier, which didn't have actually any real economic or social purpose, and often would end up being just going to waste, essentially, because it doesn't actually really serve that much of a purpose other than kind of boosting the ego of the leader in question. Now, China came in and actually provided that exact financing, but often did it, as was mentioned in the question, on the basis of this kind of Angola model, saying, well, instead of us expecting you to undergo any kind of reform, which would go against China's kind of non-interference principle, what we would like is for you to provide us with either natural resources, so particularly for those countries which China has been targeting in terms of, oil or gas, or otherwise, providing contracts to Chinese companies to, for example, build a highway, as has been the case ever since the turn of the 21st century. So that's why you've got a Chinese economic presence in pretty much every African state today. So, how does it weigh up? Well, I think obviously it's provided a lifeline for certain regimes in Africa, because indeed it's helped to invigorate the kind of persona of certain African leaders or their governments in trying to show their people that indeed they are concerned about development. And for me, it's a part of Chinese soft power, because at the end of the day, China helps to build things which people can see, right? Whether that converts into hard power and influence is probably still debatable. And indeed, I think the West, if you can talk about that, generally speaking, has suffered, because it's very probably in the long term more sensible approach, because indeed, they take into consideration the fact that can African states really repay? Can they cope with this amount of debt? I think it's suffered from being a lot less popular, because indeed, as you mentioned, some of the reforms have been brutal, and I mean, asking certain African states to for example, monetize, their education sectors, when some African citizens can't even basically pay for education, is seen as being abhorrent, essentially. Whereas China doesn't say that. It doesn't say, we expect you to undergo these kind of reforms, particularly not political reforms. Absolutely not. That's out of the question. So with leaders, it's African elites. It's been a lot seen as something which has essentially been some form of almost like a godsend at times. That China is willing to finance these projects when no one else wants to finance, and that has been talked about a lot within the African elites. That China has essentially filled a void and has been seen as a very benevolent power in that regard, whereas the West has, not only does it has its colonial legacy, on top of that it has this very austere way of promoting development, and yet it talks a good game about poverty eradication and so on and so forth, whereas China is actually helping African countries to build and create jobs, or at least this is a very simplistic message which is given. But now I think at least African leaders, particularly in the context of the pandemic, have kind of woken up to the fact. I mean, I think some were aware of this before, but as a whole, the continent seems to be waking up to the fact that maybe it wasn't such a good thing to kind of sign up willy-nilly to projects and suddenly find themselves, with just one creditor who owns, the vast majority of the debt, because then how do you negotiate? And, we've seen, this is not really this is not an African example, but with Pakistan and the CPEC, that Pakistan had racked up all this debt that suddenly it needed a bailout program by the IMF. And IMF members are saying, well, why should we bail you out for essentially having racked up debt for a project for this kind of massive initiative, which we have nothing to do with? So, it's kind of, it's tricky, because at the same time, African countries and developing countries around the world, they need to take that risk. They need to take that financial hit of accumulating some debt, because without that, you can have no construction. And without infrastructure, you can't aspire to help open up certain sectors. So, for example, Ethiopia is one of Africa's most talked about success stories. But Ethiopia is a landlocked country. So without the financing to help build railways to Djibouti, with it being its kind of unofficial port of export, then the Ethiopian economy is essentially trapped. So that's the difficulty of who's willing to finance this. Well, so the response has been now that outside of multilateral banks, we see that there are initiatives coming from the Japanese government, sometimes via the Asian Development Bank, the American government, sometimes in coalition amongst themselves, now in Australia, now the EU, and possibly the UK as well, talking about providing an alternative to the BRI. But I think that that's still talk, and when you see the figures being put forward, that they're still not on the level of the BRI, so still work to be done.
Fascinating.
I don't know if you know any examples where countries have sadly suffered debt distress and haven't been able to repay their loans. What are some examples of the sort of repayment method that China chooses in these instances? Do they sort of repossess assets, or is it sort of a restructuring of the loan, or is it just simple debt relief? I understand it's probably a case-by-case basis, but what is the general method they tend to use?
So this is, again, a really hot topic, because this question is being asked now, what's going to happen if indeed African states can't pay back their loans? Is China going to go in and repossess assets? Well, I think that that's something which is, of course, very sensitive, because if China was seen to do that, and I think the Chinese government is very wary, particularly in developing countries, of the image it gives out. So I would be surprised myself that suddenly, in one full swoop, China goes in and Chinese companies start to claim repossession of infrastructure which has been built on Chinese money. I think what's more likely is that there will be indeed what we saw in Sri Lanka, for example, with the port of Hambantota, a debt for equity swap, meaning that the Sri Lankan authorities at that moment in time had racked up so much debt that they could not buy back. So what they decided to do was to allow China Port Merchants, a Chinese state-owned company which is specialized in the building and management of ports, a 99-year lease on the port. And so actually we see now that China Merchants is really pushing to make the port more economically viable. So I think that's really what is going to happen in terms of the methodology. And in some cases there will be outright debt relief. So I think that option hasn't been taken off the table yet by the Chinese government. In fact, I think they haven't really taken a position at all, because they're waiting to see as to how things pan out. But indeed, I think in a very small amount of cases there has been outright debt relief. provided by the Chinese government. So I think it will be a mix of instruments, but the debt for equity swap seems to be a model which I think under the BRI we'll see actually happening quite a lot more, particularly if the world economy doesn't pick up over the next couple of years or so.
That's a great answer. And considering that, there is the famous adage, never let a good crisis go to waste. And a lot of Sino-skeptics might be looking at China right now and expecting them to pounce on much of the West. I mean, with many industries facing collapse, we're hearing on a daily basis about certain sectors that are having to make redundancies permanently as scarring in the economy seems to last for the long term structurally. China buying up these key infrastructures could be a potential strategy and would be viewed, I think, with potential antipathy by much of the European bodies. So how are China repositioning their Belt and Road Initiative strategy as a result of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think that the pandemic first of all, I mean, in China, the BRI is not that popular as an initiative. Okay, so in outside of China, we have a tendency to really overinflate the discussion on the BRI, talking about strategies, talking about, leveraging assets, Chinese financing, putting a stranglehold on the foreign policies of certain countries. In China, there's always been an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Why is the government spending taxpayers' money, or what seem to be taxpayers' money, on projects in Montenegro, in Kenya, in kind of, financially unviable infrastructural projects in Central America? We don't understand, because China essentially, particularly once you go outside of the kind of major cities, it seems at times very rural and poor, and sometimes quite backward essentially. So it would make sense for the ordinary citizen to ask, well, this is our money. Why is it not being invested back in China? The Chinese government would say actually part of the BRI is also to help central China and the western parts of China, so Xinjiang province and Tibet, also benefit from investments in infrastructure projects too. But this has really, I think, been exacerbated by the crisis, because what's happening in the rest of the world is also happening in China. Although China reports will actually see some kind of economic growth for 2020, it's a massive slowdown. In fact, I've read reports that about 100 million jobs have been lost in China over the course of the pandemic. So that's something which the Chinese government is going to have to take into consideration now when new BRI projects come up, or at least even existing BRI projects might have to be studied again in terms of their financing, because it might have been too much financial largesse at the time when the projects were agreed upon. So I think actually there's going to be at least a temporary slowdown in terms of the mergers and acquisitions made by Chinese companies in Europe. Now already I think there was a slowdown because legislation in Europe was becoming a bit harsher, whether individual countries or at the EU level, in terms of investment screening. Why? Because, as you said, it's becoming less and less popular for China to buy up certain assets. I mean, after the Eurozone crisis, for example, we saw Chinese investments, for example, in Portuguese electrical grid. Now, certain civil society voices in Portugal were quite worried about that, but on the whole, that went under the radar. Now that kind of investment, I think, won't be possible anymore, because there's too much of a popular reaction. I mean, we see the British government, before the pandemic, was very much talking about, how China could help it in its kind of post-Brexit context, and the Huawei decision was seen as, wasn't seen as that controversial in the UK. I mean, the government had to defend it, but there was a lot of pressure from the outside, and now suddenly there's a U-turn, right? It's no longer popular. The government will have to revisit it, and anything which has a whiff of strategic dimension towards a Chinese investment is out of the question. So I think that Chinese companies, both state-owned and private, are going to become more aware of that, and I think there's going to be general pushback in Europe, perhaps with the exception of countries which are under some form of, should I say, quasi-authoritarian leadership. Of which there are some EU member states which are, very close to being that. I'm thinking of Hungary, potentially Poland, maybe, or governments which are actually very pro-China. So if you think of the Italian government before the last elections was, actually reaching out to the Chinese. It signed an MOU on the BRI, and suddenly you had all these Italian ports which featured as potential for Chinese investments. I think those cases might still be favorable towards some form of Chinese investments, but I think in Germany, in France, in Spain, Portugal, and the UK, I think that suddenly there's a realization that it might not be such a good thing after all.
Yeah, and just before Pran asked the next question, I remember there were these photos of when Xi Jinping would meet with David Cameron and George Osborne, and they'd be pouring pints and eating fish and chips in the Lake District or wherever they were. And I think those photos in the next few years are going to look like massive mistakes in that sense, because as you say, the complete strategy towards China, which previously was fine, there's all these human rights abuses going on, but we get growth, investment, jobs. I don't think that's going to be palatable to the British public as a result of the last few years unfolding in the calamitous way that it has.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, under Cameron's leadership in particular, the UK had it wasn't complete pandering towards China, but it was courting China indeed for reasons of growth and investment. And I mean, at the end of the day, the UK shouldn't completely disregard Chinese investment. I mean, I think we shouldn't keep switching from one extreme to the other. Chinese investment should be welcome where it makes sense. It should be thought out in an intelligent manner. That's all, and in a rational manner without kind of being overly emotional. At the same time, though, I mean, David Cameron did, envisage inviting the Dalai Lama, which upset the Chinese considerably, and they warned about repercussions. The Chinese leaned on David Cameron to get the EU to change its mind on granting China market economy status, which didn't work out either. So, I mean, it wasn't. There was an embrace, but it wasn't. There were also areas of contention as well.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, on the Dalai Lama issue, did the Chinese government ask for them to submit like an apology or something? I can't remember how that ended up playing out. There was some demand for the civil servants to give a verbal response back, I think. I can't remember.
Usually there is usually there has to be some form of kind of the government backtracking on that. That's a really good example of Chinese economic statecraft. Essentially, the government has to then say that it recognizes Chinese sovereignty and the sovereignty of the Chinese Communist Party over China. So I mean, it's he's not the only European leader to have attempted to gain some kind of political capital out of that. Sarkozy tried the same in France. And then what happened is the Chinese cancelled the EU-China summit that year. And whenever a Chinese leader happened to go to Europe on a kind of spending spree, as they call them, they circumvented France. I mean, probably there was a year of poor relations between the two countries, but, that's water under the bridge when a next government or the government just issues an official apology and says that it won't ever consider that ever again, etc.
Something I just wanted to touch on and sort of with a look to the future and considering it in a more broader long-term way is that in 2016, obviously Donald Trump was elected on a highly nationalist, inward-looking sort of America First campaign, and then we see in 2017 Xi Jinping announced the BRI with huge investment globally. And then when we look sort of historically and we think the Cold War was about extending spheres of influences, and with both sides tried to extending their power in a different region globally. What in this sort of context, how should the EU be reacting? Should we expect to see some sort of increase in foreign investment from the States in the future? What should we expect to see?
I expect to see so much from the EU, and yet we're usually very disappointed with their response. I mean, I think the EU is again EU foreign policy towards China is usually conditioned to a certain extent on how America is going to respond. I mean, yes, these are sovereign nations, and the EU has its own kind of foreign policy independence, but essentially, you can't see the EU moving too close towards China because, most countries, of course, still have that long-standing affiliation with the United States, the Transatlantic Alliance. They're part of NATO. And, I think some are just hoping to ride out the Trump administration and hope there's some form of normality after 2020. We've not really seen much of a response from the EU, to be honest, pertaining to the BRI. The EU has come up with its own kind of connectivity strategy, which is linked to the BRI and linked also to kind of economic growth and infrastructure investment opportunities in Asia. But beyond the kind of policy document and maybe a recalibration of financing, there's not really been a lot to talk about. I guess the only thing which is of note here is that in 2017, during the BRI forum, the EU was the only invited actor. So they had the EU plus all the EU member states, heads of state who'd been invited to the forum, who, to the surprise of the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, who drafted this kind of the memorandum of understanding at the end of the forum to be signed off by all the participants, they gave it to the EU, and all the EU heads of state rejected it. And that was, the Chinese were not anticipating that. And the EU said, and I think they were right, that they didn't sign off on this because they didn't agree to some of the standards inherent to the BRI, environmental standards, social standards, labor law standards, and so on and so forth. So they could not agree for as long as they thought it was substandard in that regard. So that's really the kind of statement, I think, which we don't come to see from the EU very often, and I think the EU should really, use its weight in strategic manner in that regard more often towards China. Actually, I think we'll probably end up seeing that because indeed in Europe there's going to be a kind of more skeptical view of China. But then whether that will align itself with what Trump wants to do for the United States, presupposing that Trump will be re-elected, I don't see the EU wanting to align itself. And indeed, how could it? Because essentially all of Trump's policies are indeed, as you mentioned, all about specific national interests or the interests of specific regions in the United States, which are part of Trump's electorate, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Something that cannot be overlooked when considering much of this analysis is how this collides with the politics of energy. And with China now being the biggest importer of oil and soon to be gas, and with climate change at the forefront of many institutional and governmental minds, how does this play out? Because China, for example, may want to build an oil refinery in a certain country because it means they then have some importing strategy, for example, but that may conflict completely with some of the domestic climate demands that certain countries are having to meet.
Yeah, well, that's, I wouldn't say that the BRI is exactly climate friendly, because, if you look at the kinds of projects which are being built, it's more infrastructure, more condos, more of the things where you wonder, is it really making this infrastructure more climate efficient? And although, most BRI projects are supposed to respect an environmental impact assessment, there have been reports that projects actually, don't really respect them as they should, or overlook the findings of these environmental impact assessments, because building the infrastructure and the end result is more important than, the kind of environmental impacts. It would be easy to kind of broad brush saying that the BRI does nothing related to supporting climate change, which is wrong, because indeed the BRI hopes to lean on green financing. That's one of the kind of key components. And China, the Chinese government has actually been one of the largest drivers behind investment in green technology. Although probably not enough, because China still is very much dependent on coal, overly dependent on coal for its energy sources. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of BRI projects are indeed connected to oil pipelines, LNG pipelines, and facilitating maritime transportation as well. So that also means still depending on the import of oil and gas. it's not about the BRI converting the Chinese economy towards something which is purely, kind of energy efficient. So, I guess we should. The climate change debate benefits from China being a supporter behind, for example, the Paris Agreement, and that China does invest tremendously in the development of green technology, and its implementation in China is quite impressive. But the BRI as a whole, I don't think is really something that we could consider to be climate friendly. So that's also, and that's part of the risks inherent to BRI projects, which I think that particularly Western countries which advocate for the fight against climate change should seek to raise awareness of, along the Silk Road, towards local stakeholders. Be careful for what you wish for, not just in terms of debt sustainability, but also environmental sustainability too.
Just in summary, as we don't want to take too much of your time, that you've very kindly given us, when considering China's expansion of foreign investment or the BRI more generally, what are the key points of contestation? What should people really be looking out for? It's kind of a broad question, but it's just as a wrap up. What are the sort of key debates that people should be looking out for when reading the BRI, about the BRI in the news, or researching themselves?
I think contestation is a good word, because indeed I think the BRI has also triggered, sometimes indirectly, and even sometimes in authoritarian states, issues relating to human rights abuses. This is something which we wouldn't really expect at first when thinking about the BRI, but even in a country like Kazakhstan, kind of growing Chinese investment and a growing Chinese presence in terms of the workforce, present building roads and pipelines, has actually triggered concern with regards to the treatment of Kazakh citizens and Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. I think that when looking at the BRI, it's important to, I would say one of the key issues is to try and understand, the dynamics behind the individual projects. And I think you raised a good point earlier about it's a case-by-case basis, because not all BRI projects are the same. So, of course, it's important to keep in mind the specifics, but really it's about the dynamics. So it's about who came up with the idea of these projects in the first place. Who is financing them? So when I'm talking about who, it's not just on the Chinese side, it's also about the local actors. Who are we talking about? And within the local actors is also, are there groups who are outright opposed to these BRI projects? Are they NGOs? Is it the opposition? What's their voice, and did they have an influence in terms of determining the projects? And then also the third parties involved, who are often kind of silent actors here, and often passive actors, but I think that's slowly changing. What role do they have to play as well? Probably an example which is not often known is in Bangladesh. There was a port in a town called Sonadia, where there was meant to be a Chinese finance port being built, because in Bangladesh you only really have one port for imports and exports, and that's Dhaka. But it's saturated, and that's actually a hindrance to Bangladeshi imports and exports. So the aim is for the Bangladeshi government to diversify its commercial ports, but that takes a lot of investment and time. So the idea was to build a series of ports, and one was this port of Sonadia. But that port was actually cancelled by pressure coming from Tokyo, Washington, and New Delhi to get the Bangladeshis to actually then agree to the port of Matabari, which is financed by Japan, co-financed by Japan and India. So, there's also the kind of third-party geopolitics into BRI projects as well. It's just that, if you don't know about them, they kind of go under the radar. So it's interesting to see that, local actors in their decision-making are also now becoming pressured by the geopolitics, underpinning the BRI too. So I think really that's the key. It's trying to understand the dynamics of individual projects. How did they come about? If you go back to Sri Lanka, Chinese state-owned companies had actually considered some of these infrastructure projects as part of their long-term strategies. So after the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, some of the companies were helping to rebuild the country for free. They were actually building roads, knowing that if they did this for free, at a later date, there would be contracts which they could monetize and therefore recoup their investment, so to speak. And that's what happened with the early BRI projects in Sri Lanka as well. So, it's interesting to see these dynamics, which we tend to depict as China and recipient country, but actually sometimes it's the company, the Chinese company with a long-term strategy and having built up its own network in the recipient state. And then in the recipient state, you have a myriad of actors as well who have their own interests and rivaling interests, and that has a role in shaping existing projects, but also refusing proposed projects as well. So I would say that's really what people have to look out for and trying to understand the BRI, because that will ultimately help shape the destiny of the BRI in terms of its success or potential failure as well.
Brilliant. This is all really fascinating. The job now comes to me to wrap this all up if possible. So you'll have to give your marks to see how I do. But the real motivations underpinning much of the Belt and Road Initiative, it partially starts with dealing with excess production. So we've talked before about already. So making sure we can have lower steel prices, for example, or also the fact that they have excess currency reserves out in places like New York and don't want to deal with hyperinflation. So spreading money around elsewhere is a very useful tactic. But it's also part of a soft power expansion, as you said. It's the ability to lean on certain nation states to make their form of governance, Chinese sovereignty, far more palatable to much of the world as they try to claim a hand on being the great world superpower. But treating the Belt and Road Initiative as a behemoth is somewhat problematic. We need to understand the institutional networks that drive the key policies, as you suggested before. A key feature and theme coming out from a lot of this was their debt programs, and how actually there's maybe something to be learned from the lack of conditionality on some of these loans. This is something that I think lots of people are looking at China with a very critical, skeptical eye at the moment, which I think is probably worthwhile. But that's not to say we can't learn from some of the key policies being implemented there. And even though certain other countries, certain other networks, international institutions are potentially trying to position themselves now as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, the magnitude of this project will be incredibly difficult to match. And considering the current moment, historical, social moment that we're in regarding the coronavirus crisis, they might not be as expansive as previously suggested, because, as you say, part of this is an image focused thing, not just their image to the rest of the world, but their image domestically, internally as well. And they may need to employ different strategies to come out better. It might be the use of the media, for example. We've seen they're showing all the protests going on in America, saying, "Oh my God, isn't this terrible?" Because loads of these people haven't seen a protest before, or at the same sort of level anyway, out on the streets. And as you say, domestically, the Belt and Road Initiative isn't that popular, which is, it makes sense. You can imagine. There's lots of people that say we spend far too much money on foreign aid in this country. In the UK even. I know you're in Malaysia at the moment, but I can't imagine if you tried that in the UK, how they would approach it. And kind of touching on the climate politics of it all, which I find fascinating. As it stands, the Belt and Road Initiative isn't necessarily compatible with climate justice. And although there's going to be greater friction from places like Europe, it doesn't seem to currently be enough. And ultimately, what this seems to be the case is this hinges on the election of a few key politicians. That could really be completely transform the trajectory of direction that much of the West, in quote unquote, they could go on. So it sounds to me like a very sort of uncertain, unpredictable time, as is consistent, I guess, in some way with
2020.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think we underestimate the power of democracy, not just in the West, but also in democracies worldwide, where actually even like let's take Maldives, for example, a country of 500,000 people. They elect a new president in 2018, and that president comes out and says, we're maybe not so keen on BRI projects, and actually suddenly you've got a shift of foreign policy which becomes more pro-Indian, and we know that India and China on a number of issues, but BRI is one of them, is not looking exactly eye to eye. So, I think actually that can be one of probably a crucial obstacle to the BRI's success will indeed be potential democratic change. So indeed, I fully agree, and I'd give you easily 80 marks for that summary. So,
I also give good marks for that.
Yeah, I don't know what that's out of. That could be 100.
Out of 100. First class mark for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, brilliant. Well, let's hope that translates into my university degree this year. We'll see. We'll touch this base. But Dr. Barton, thank you so much for your time. All right. Cheers.
Thank you very much.